History has always viewed the monarch's bedchamber as the place where heirs are born to secure the nation. But for Louis XVIII in 1815, the reality was entirely different. The King of France was aging and frail, his body so swollen by disease that he could barely move. By his side, there should have been a queen. Instead, the king's private chambers were reserved for a handsome young man. The world called him the king's son. The king called him his only refuge. Yet over 2,000 surviving letters reveal a different truth. This was not a father's love, it was jealousy, obsession, and an intense passion that crossed every line. Without you, I am but a soulless corpse. This confession from a king to a man 30 years his junior defied every religious and royal taboo of the era. To deceive the world, they were forced to hide behind the titles of father and son. Behind the velvet curtains of power, let us unveil the secret of the true relationship that shocked and terrified the entire Bourbon court. But to understand how such a scandalous obsession took root, we must first look at the man trapped at its center. King Louis XVIII sat in his oversized wheelchair, a contraption of mahogany and velvet designed to accommodate his immense girth. At 60 years old, he was morbidly obese, his legs swollen and ulcerated by advanced gout that made every movement a trial of agony. His extremities were often wrapped in flannel, and his mobility was so restricted that he had to be wheeled from room to room by attendants. To the casual observer, he was a grotesque figure, a symbol of the old regime's decay, slow, ponderous, and seemingly detached. But those who looked into his eyes saw something different. Behind the heavy lids and the fleshy face lay a sharp, glittering intellect. This was a man who had survived exile across Europe, while his brother lost his head to the guillotine. He was cynical, widely read in Latin classics, and possessed a biting wit that could shred a courtier's ego in seconds. Yet for all his intelligence, Louis XVIII was consumed by a profound hollow loneliness that no amount of food or power could fill. He was a widower. His wife, Marie Josephine of Savoy, had died 5 years earlier in England during their long exile. Their marriage had been a cold, barren arrangement, childless and devoid of warmth, defined by separate bedrooms and rumors of unconsummated duties. Louis had no son to inherit his throne, no daughter to comfort his old age. His immediate family offered no solace. His younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, was a religious fanatic and a political extremist who openly undermined the king's moderate policies. His niece, the Duchess of Angoulême, the only surviving child of Louis XVI, was a woman hardened by trauma, her face perpetually set in a mask of tragic severity. In this crowded court, surrounded by sycophants, spies, and ambitious aristocrats clamoring for reclaimed titles, the King of France was the loneliest man in Europe. It was in this atmosphere of physical decay and emotional starvation that the king's daily routine became a desperate hunt for distraction. He craved conversation. He needed a mirror, someone who could reflect his own intelligence back at him, someone who could entertain him without boring him, someone who could offer a semblance of the intimacy he had been denied his entire life. The king's sexuality had always been a subject of hushed whispers. He had never taken royal mistresses in the style of his grandfather, Louis XV. He had no illegitimate children, no scandals with actresses or maids. Instead, his emotional history was a catalog of intense, sentimental, and arguably romantic attachments to other men. He sought out favorites, male companions, upon whom he could lavish a possessive, almost maternal yet deeply romantic affection. He wanted to mentor, to shape, and to be adored in return. But in the chaotic summer of 1815, his heart was vacant. The political situation was as precarious as the king's health. Following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, France was occupied by foreign armies. The Prussians were encamped in the frantic streets of Paris, and the country was tearing itself apart in the White Terror. Royalist mobs in the South were lynching Bonapartists and Protestants, seeking vengeance for the revolution. The ultra-royalists, or ultras, demanded blood. They wanted purges, executions, and a return to the absolute monarchy of the previous century. Louis XVIII, however, knew that such extremism would lead to another revolution. He needed to navigate a middle path, to reconcile the old France of the nobility with the new France of the revolution. To do this, he needed administrators who were not blinded by ancient grudges. He needed men of talent, regardless of their birth. It was through this crack in the aristocratic armor that Élie Decazes slipped into the king's light. Born in 1780 in the quiet region of the Gironde, Élie Decazes was 35 years old, a man in the prime of his life. He was not a high prince of the blood. He was a bourgeois, a lawyer's son who had clawed his way up through talent and charm. He was strikingly handsome with a tall, slender frame, a shock of dark hair, and piercing, expressive blue eyes that seemed to hold a reservoir of empathy. He possessed a natural elegance that rivaled the oldest dukes, but with a modern energy that the dusty courtiers lacked. Decazes was a survivor. He had served as a judge under Napoleon, navigated the treacherous waters of the empire, and even served the Bonaparte family directly. To the rigid ultras, he was a weathercock, a man of flexible loyalties, who turned whichever way the wind blew. But to Louis XVIII, he was a breath of fresh air in a tomb. Their paths crossed out of necessity. In the wake of the 100 Days, Napoleon's brief return to power, the police ministry was in shambles. The king needed a prefect of police for Paris who was competent enough to maintain order, but moderate enough not to incite a riot. Decazes was recommended for the post. When he was first presented to the king, the contrast was jarring. The immense gout-ridden monarch in his wheelchair and the vibrant, graceful young lawyer standing before him. The first meetings were strictly professional, yet charged with an immediate, unspoken chemistry. As prefect of police, it was Decazes' duty to report directly to the king on the mood of the city, the rumors in the salons, and the threats against the throne. Louis XVIII, unable to walk the streets of his own capital, had an insatiable appetite for gossip. He wanted to know everything: the scandals, the whispers, the private lives of his enemies and his friends. Decazes quickly realized that the king did not just want dry statistics, he wanted stories. And Decazes was a master storyteller. He began to curate his reports. He brought the king the scandalous details of Paris, narrating them with wit and verve. He learned to read the king's moods, knowing exactly when to be serious and when to inject a note of humor to make the old man chuckle. He treated the king not with the stiff, terrified reverence of the old nobility, but with a warm, respectful deference that felt personal. He listened. For a king who was used to being lectured by his angry brother or petitioned by desperate nobles, having a handsome young man simply sit and listen was a narcotic. The king began to extend the audiences. A 20-minute briefing turned into an hour, then 2. Louis found excuses to summon the prefect back to the Tuileries in the evenings. He began to look forward to the sound of Decazes' footsteps in the corridor. The physical revulsion that many felt toward the king's diseased body was entirely absent in Decazes' demeanor. The young lawyer would sit close to the wheelchair, leaning in to speak in low, conspiratorial tones, creating a private world that excluded the rest of the court. It was during these early months of late 1815 that the relationship shifted from the professional to the intensely personal. The king, starved for affection, began to project his dormant emotional needs onto Decazes. He saw in the young man the son he never had, but also the idealized companion he had always dreamed of. He began to refer to Decazes in terms that blurred the lines of protocol. He was no longer just Monsieur le Préfet. He was becoming something else. The court, sharp-eyed and vicious, noticed the change immediately. They saw the way the king's heavy eyes lit up when Decazes entered the room. They saw the way the king would reach out to touch Decazes' arm to emphasize a point, his hand lingering longer than necessary. They heard the laughter drifting from the king's private cabinet, a sound that had been absent for years. The ultras, led by the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, watched with growing alarm. They saw Decazes as a dangerous upstart, a liberal infection in the heart of the monarchy. They sneered at his bourgeois background, mocking his lack of noble titles. They whispered that he was seducing the king, manipulating the senile monarch's mind through his blue eyes. But the king did not care. For the first time in decades, he felt alive. The connection was intellectual, certainly. They shared a vision of a moderate constitutional monarchy. But the foundation was emotional. Louis XVIII was falling in love. It was a love that defied simple categorization. It was not the predatory lust of a tyrant, nor was it the simple camaraderie of friends. It was a consuming, obsessive, romantic fixation. The king began to worry obsessively about Decazes' health, his safety, his happiness. When Decazes fell ill with a minor cold, the king was beside himself with anxiety, sending doctors and notes every hour. The dynamic was established. The aging, immobile king as the possessive, doting mentor, and the young, mobile Decazes as the beloved disciple, the eyes and ears of the sovereign. It was a symbiosis. Decazes provided the king with a connection to the modern world and the emotional sustenance he craved. The king provided Decazes with protection and a rapid ascent to power that would have been impossible otherwise. As the winter of 1815 set in, the intimacy deepened. The king began to write to Decazes. At first, the notes were brief instructions or queries about police matters, but soon the tone shifted. The formal address dissolved into terms of endearment. The king started using a cipher of intimacy, a private language of affection that would soon scandalize the historians who uncovered it. He called Decazes mon fils, my son, a term that offered a safe religious and dynastic cover for his feelings. In the eyes of the church and the state, a king loving a subject like a son was virtuous. But the emotional temperature of the letters told a different story. I feel the need to see you, to speak to you, to tell you how much I love you, the king would write. Sometimes late at night after Decazes had just left the palace. The sheer volume of correspondence was staggering. Even when they had spent hours together, the king felt the need to bridge the separation of the night with ink and paper. He was terrified of losing this new source of warmth. He was terrified that Decazes would tire of him, or that the vicious court would drive him away. Decazes, for his part, walked a razor's edge. He was genuinely fond of the king. He found Louis's intellect stimulating and his vulnerability touching. But he was also a man of immense ambition. He knew that his position was entirely dependent on the king's favor. He had no natural base of support among the aristocracy. To them, he was a usurper. He had to be everything to the king: son, student, nurse, minister, and confidant. He had to absorb the king's emotional neediness without suffocating under it. He had to endure the smell of the sick room, the endless repetitive stories, the jealous possessiveness, and the public displays of affection that made the courtiers snicker. One evening, in the private apartments of the Tuileries, the king made a gesture that signaled to the entire household that the hierarchy had changed. As Decazes prepared to leave after a long session of work, the king struggled to shift his massive bulk in the chair. He reached out, grabbing Decazes' hand with a desperate grip. Tears welled in the old monarch's eyes, a common occurrence, for Louis was a man of easy tears, and he pulled the young man down so that his head rested against the royal chest. "You are the only one who understands me," the king whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Do not abandon me to these wolves." It was a plea, not a command. In that moment, the absolute monarch of France, the descendant of St. Louis, and the Sun King, surrendered his heart to the son of a provincial lawyer. The bond was sealed. Decazes was no longer just a minister, he was the favorite, a title that carried with it unlimited power and unlimited danger. The king had found his dear child, his Élie, and he was determined to build a wall around him, a fortress of favor that no enemy could breach. The romance was sealed, but the political fortress was under siege. The intimacy of the king's cabinet could not protect them from the reality of a fractured France. The honeymoon phase of their governance was over. The war for control of the Restoration was moving from whispers to open conflict. By early 1816, the battle lines were drawn not just in the streets, but within the palace walls themselves. By early 1816, the Tuileries Palace had effectively split into two hostile camps. On the ground floor lived the king and his moderate ministers, a sanctuary of compromise and pragmatic governance. Upstairs in the Pavillon de Marsan, the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, held court with the ultras. This rival court was a nest of reactionaries who viewed the French Revolution not as a historical event to be managed, but as a criminal aberration to be erased. They despised the king's caution. They despised the charter that guaranteed civil liberties. But most of all, they despised the man who now stood as the gatekeeper to the king's chambers, Élie Decazes. The tension was palpable. The ultras controlled the Chamber of Deputies, which the king had ironically dubbed the Chambre introuvable, the unobtainable chamber, because it was more royalist than the king. This parliament was a disaster for the monarchy. Filled with provincial squires and fanatical nobles, they demanded the execution of Bonapartists, the return of confiscated church lands, and the restoration of absolute clerical power. They were bloodthirsty and deaf to political reality. Louis XVIII, old and cynical, knew that giving them what they wanted would trigger another revolution within months. He needed to dissolve this dangerous assembly, but he lacked the physical stamina to fight his own family and the entire aristocracy alone. He needed a weapon. Decazes became that weapon. Decazes understood the mechanics of power better than the dukes who sneered at his bourgeois background. He recognized that the king's physical infirmity made him vulnerable to the relentless bullying of the ultras. The king could not run away. He was trapped in his chair. So Decazes built a protective wall around him. He took control of the king's schedule, filtering who could enter the royal study. He intercepted the angry letters from the Comte d'Artois. He managed the news that reached the king's ears, ensuring that Louis heard not the fanatical ravings of the Pavillon de Marsan, but the moderate, sensible voice of his dear son. This was not merely emotional manipulation, it was a political survival strategy. Decazes convinced the king that the ultra-dominated chamber was a threat to the crown itself. He argued that true royal authority lay in the king's ability to dissolve parliament, not in submitting to the will of extremists. It was a bold gamble. dissolving a royalist parliament to save the monarchy seemed paradoxical. But Decazes played on the king's deepest fear, the memory of his brother, Louis XVI, who had lost his head because he was too weak to control the factions around him. Decazes offered Louis the spine he needed. On September 5, 1816, emboldened by Decazes' constant reassurance, Louis XVIII signed the ordinance dissolving the Chambre introuvable. The shockwave was immense. The ultras were stunned. They had believed they owned the Restoration. Now they had been crushed by a cripple and a parvenu. The hatred for Decazes transformed from snobbish disdain into a lethal political vendetta. He was no longer just a favorite. He was the architect of their defeat. They attacked him with a ferocity that ignored all decorum. In the salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, aristocrats refused to say his name. They called him Sejanus, the corrupt favorite of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, or simply the king's disease. They spread rumors that he was a Mason, a closet Bonapartist, or a spy who had sold the king to the liberals. Yet every attack only drove the king and Decazes closer. The external pressure forged a bond of us against the world. The dynamics of their intimacy settled into a ritualistic domesticity that was bizarre to outsiders but essential to Louis. Their interactions were not defined by the stiff protocol of Versailles. They were defined by the messy human reality of the king's condition. Louis was a man in constant pain. His body was rotting. The smell in his private rooms was often overpowering, a mix of gangrene and unwashed heavy fabrics. Courtiers would hold their breath during the audiences. Decazes did not. He sat by the king's knee for hours, unfazed by the odors or the grotesque sight of the king's swollen legs. He adjusted the king's pillows. He fetched his papers. He performed the small, intimate acts of care that the king's own family, too dignified and too disgusted, refused to do. This physical acceptance was the bedrock of the king's obsession. Louis XVIII was a man of immense intellect, trapped in a vessel of shame. To have a young, handsome, vibrant man treat that vessel with tenderness was a narcotic more potent than any opium. In return, Louis poured his intellect into Decazes. He tutored him. They spent evenings reading Latin texts, discussing history, and analyzing the psychology of their enemies. Louis was molding Decazes into the statesman he could not be. He was vicariously living a second life through the younger man's body. When Decazes walked, the king felt he was walking. When Decazes charmed a diplomat, the king felt the thrill of the conquest. The correspondence from this period reveals the total collapse of boundaries. The king wrote to Decazes 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day. If Decazes went to the countryside for a weekend, the king's letters became frantic, filled with the anxiety of an abandoned child. "I am like a body without a soul when you are not here," Louis wrote. "My life is suspended until your return." He demanded minute details of Decazes' day, what he ate, who he saw, how he slept. It was a suffocating surveillance disguised as paternal concern. The paternal label was the shield they both used. By relentlessly referring to Decazes as mon fils, my son, Louis neutralized the accusation of sodomy that hovered at the edges of the court's gossip. A king loving a son was biblical, patriarchal, and safe. A king loving a man 30 years his junior with romantic intensity was a crime against nature and the state. The son construct allowed them to be physically affectionate in public without crossing the line into treason. It allowed the king to embrace Decazes, to kiss his forehead, to hold his hand, all under the guise of a benevolent father blessing his chosen heir. Decazes played his part in this theater with consummate skill. He addressed the king as sire and father, blending deference with filial devotion. But he was not a passive victim of the king's affection. He was an active operator. He used the king's dependency to push through a series of liberal reforms that modernized France. He reorganized the army, purged the most fanatical ultras from the prefectures, and relaxed censorship laws. He was trying to build a royalism of the middle class, a monarchy that relied on the support of bankers, lawyers, and merchants rather than the fossilized nobility. This policy, known as the system of Decazes, worked for a time. The economy stabilized. The occupation armies withdrew in 1818, a diplomatic triumph that Decazes orchestrated. For a brief moment, it seemed that the odd couple, the invalid king and the bourgeois lawyer, had saved France, but success only deepened the resentment of the king's family. The Duchess of Angoulême, the orphan of the Temple, who had survived the revolution that killed her parents, looked at Decazes with cold, implacable hatred. She saw him as a symbol of the very forces that had destroyed her childhood. To her, Decazes was a crypto-Jacobin, a wolf in courtier's clothing who was manipulating her senile uncle to finish what the guillotine had started. The domestic war within the Tuileries turned petty and vicious. The ultras snubbed Decazes' wife, a low-ranking heiress he had married with the king's blessing to secure his status. They refused to attend balls where Decazes was the guest of honor. They bribed servants to steal papers from his desk. The king retaliated with the pettiness of a jealous lover. If a courtier disrespected Decazes, the king froze them out. He stripped titles, canceled pensions, and banished offenders from Paris. The message was brutal and clear. To touch Decazes was to strike the king. By 1819, Decazes was the undisputed master of the government. He was Minister of the Interior and practically the Prime Minister. The king had elevated him to the peerage. The lawyer's son was now a count and a peer of France. But the higher he rose, the more isolated the king became. Louis had alienated his brother, his niece, and the entire old nobility to protect his favorite. The monarchy had shrunk to a party of two. The intensity of the relationship began to strain Decazes. The king's love was a heavy weight. Louis was demanding, neurotic, and physically deteriorating. His gout worsened, making him even more immobile and irritable. He required constant entertainment. Decazes had to work a full day running the French state, dealing with budgets, riots, and diplomacy, and then spend his evenings managing the emotions of a sick, lonely, old man. He could not show fatigue. He could not show boredom. He had to be the radiant Élie, the source of light in the king's dark room. It was an exhausting performance, and cracks were beginning to show. Decazes began to suffer from chest ailments and fatigue, likely psychosomatic symptoms of the immense pressure. He tried to gently distance himself, taking brief trips to the country or citing work to avoid the endless evening sessions. But every withdrawal only made the king grasp tighter. "You are killing me with your silence," the king would scribble on a note sent across the palace at midnight. "Do you not know that I live only for you?" The political ground was also shifting beneath them. The liberal reforms had emboldened the left. In the elections of 1819, authentic revolutionaries, men who had voted for the death of Louis XVI, began to win seats in the chamber. The ultras pointed at these results and screamed, "We told you so." They argued that Decazes' moderation was opening the door to the Jacobins. They claimed that by suppressing the royalists, he was handing the country over to the regicides. Decazes was trapped in the middle. The left didn't trust him because he was a royal favorite. The right hated him because he was a liberal. His only support was the king. And the king was dying by inches. The system of Decazes was a house of cards built on the heartbeat of one old man. If the king's heart stopped or if his will broke, Decazes would fall. The atmosphere in Paris in the winter of 1819 to 1820 was toxic. The air was thick with conspiracy theories. The ultras were openly discussing a change of ministry, which was a polite way of discussing a coup against the favorite. The press, which Decazes had freed, turned on him, attacking his policies and mocking his relationship with the king. Caricatures appeared in the streets depicting Decazes as a puppet master or a seducer. Louis XVIII saw these attacks and was filled with a cold, impotent rage. He realized that he could not force France to love Decazes. He began to fear for his favorite's life. He remembered the violence of the revolution too well. He knew that when the mob or the dukes wanted blood, they eventually got it. In his private moments, the king's letters took on a fatalistic tone. He wrote of their bond as something sacred, something that transcended the dirty reality of politics, something that would only be understood by God. "Let them bark," he told Decazes. "We are above them." But they were not above the violence of the age. The rhetoric of the ultras had created a climate where political murder was becoming a valid topic of conversation. They framed Decazes not just as a bad minister, but as an existential threat to the House of Bourbon. If the Bourbon line was to be saved, the obstacle had to be removed. The king's physical inability to produce an heir meant the future lay with the Duc de Berry, the king's nephew. The Duke was the hope of the ultras, the only man capable of continuing the dynasty. The contrast was stark. The sterile king and his favorite on one side, and the virile Duc de Berry and the future on the other. Decazes, sensing the danger, tried to reconcile with the ultras. He offered compromises. He tried to tighten press censorship, but it was too late. The hatred had become personal and irrational. They didn't want to change a policy. They wanted his head. The king, sensing the closing trap, held on to Decazes with a desperate, trembling grip. The evenings in the Tuileries became somber vigils. The two men would sit by the fire, the king recounting the horrors of 1793, Decazes listening to the ticking of the clock, both of them aware that the silence outside the palace walls was the silence before a storm. The vague dread that had hung over the Tuileries for months finally materialized on a wet Sunday in February. The political metaphors of knives and blood were about to become literal. The carnival was in full swing, but the tragedy was waiting in the shadows of the Rue de Richelieu. The storm had arrived, and it would strike with terrifying precision. The breaking point arrived on the night of Shrove Sunday, February 13th, 1820. Paris was in the grip of carnival. The streets were cold and wet, but the mood was raucous. Masks, wine, and noise filled the boulevards. At the Royal Opera on the Rue de Richelieu, the elite of the Restoration had gathered for a performance of Le Carnaval de Venise. The Duc de Berry and his young wife, the Duchess Marie Caroline, were in the royal box. They were the future of the monarchy. The king was old and sterile. The Comte d'Artois was aging. The survival of the Bourbon line rested entirely on the Duc de Berry producing a male heir. He was the only branch of the tree capable of bearing fruit. Around 11 p.m., the Duchess decided to leave early. She was tired. The Duke dutifully escorted her to her carriage waiting at the side entrance. The street was dimly lit, shadowed by the high walls of the theater. Soldiers stood guard, but the atmosphere was relaxed. This was a night of celebration, not war. The Duke handed his wife into the carriage, waved goodbye, and turned to head back into the opera house to finish watching the ballet. At that moment, a man surged from the shadows behind the sentry box. He was small, unremarkable, dressed in a gray coat. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man who has rehearsed a single action 1,000 times. He grabbed the Duke's shoulder with his left hand, and with his right drove a long, crude stiletto into the Duke's chest. The blade entered below the right breast, piercing the lung. The Duc de Berry staggered. "I am assassinated," he cried, clutching the hilt of the weapon still buried in his flesh. "I am a dead man." The assassin, a saddlemaker named Louis Pierre Louvel, did not try to fight. He ran, knocking over a waiter from a nearby cafe, before being tackled by soldiers and bystanders. He did not scream. He did not beg. He had achieved his objective. He had struck the only vital target in the dynasty. The scene descended into absolute bedlam. The Duchess, hearing her husband's cry, threw herself out of the moving carriage and ran back to him, her dress dragging in the mud. They carried the bleeding prince not back to the palace, but into the administration rooms of the opera. He was laid out on a makeshift bed of benches and cushions in a small, stifling antechamber. Decazes was one of the first officials to arrive. He had been at a ball nearby when the news hit. He rushed to the opera, still in his formal evening wear, his face pale. As the Minister of Police, this was his jurisdiction. It was his failure. The security of the heir to the throne was his responsibility. When he entered the room, the smell of blood and panic hit him. Doctors were already swarming the dying man, applying the brutal medical treatments of the era, bleeding him, probing the wound with unwashed fingers, applying suction cups. The Duke was groaning in agony, coughing up blood, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. Decazes approached the bed, tears streaming down his face. He was genuinely horrified. Whatever his political differences with the Duc de Berry, and they were significant, for the Duke was an ultra-sympathizer. Decazes was a royalist. He did not want the king's nephew dead. But as he stepped forward to offer assistance, he felt the temperature in the room drop. The courtiers surrounding the bed turned to look at him. Their eyes were not filled with shared grief. They were filled with accusation. The Duchess of Angoulême, the king's niece and the iron lady of the family, stared at Decazes with a look of pure vitriol. In the logic of the ultras, Louvel was just the instrument. The real assassin was the man who had relaxed censorship, the man who had allowed liberal ideas to fester, the man who had weakened the monarchy's defenses. Decazes. "This is the result of your policy," a courtier hissed loud enough for the room to hear. It was the first shot in a barrage that would not stop until Decazes was destroyed. Messages were sent to the Tuileries to wake the king. Louis XVIII was asleep, his heavy body difficult to rouse and even harder to dress. It took agonizing hours to prepare the invalid monarch and transport him to the opera. In the meantime, the interrogation of the assassin began in a nearby room. Decazes, desperate to prove a conspiracy, desperate to find accomplices to deflect the blame from his own administration, oversaw the questioning. "Who paid you?" Decazes demanded. "Who are your masters?" Louvel looked at the minister with calm, fanatical eyes. "I have no accomplices," he said. "I have intended to do this since 1814. I wanted to kill the king, but he is old. The Duc de Berry is young. To kill the tree, one must cut the root." The answer was a disaster for Decazes. If Louvel was part of a vast Jacobin conspiracy, Decazes could rally the nation against a common enemy. But a lone wolf? A single fanatic? That meant the failure was one of prevention. It meant the police had failed to spot a man who had been stalking the royals for years. And worse, the ultras did not believe it. They refused to accept that a saddle maker could act alone. They insisted that Decazes knew, or at least that his liberal allies had wound the man up like a clockwork toy. By the time King Louis XVIII arrived at 4 a.m., the Duc de Berry was near death. The scene was grotesque. The room was packed with sobbing relatives, priests administering the last rites and doctors performing useless, torturous procedures. The king was wheeled to the bedside. He took his nephew's hand. The Duke, lucid despite the pain, whispered a request that would haunt the political landscape for weeks. "Sire," the dying man gasped, "pardon the man who struck me. Pardon him, so that I may die in peace." Louis XVIII, the pragmatist, the cynic, looked at his dying nephew and demurred. "We will see," he said. "We will speak of it later." He could not pardon a regicide. Justice had to be brutal to save face. At 6:30 a.m., the Duc de Berry died. The wailing of the Duchess Marie Caroline signaled the end. The king closed his nephew's eyes. Then he turned his wheelchair to leave. As he did, his eyes sought out Decazes. The favorite was standing in the corner, shattered, isolated, a pariah in a room full of enemies. The king signaled for Decazes to walk beside his chair. It was a final, defiant act of protection. Even in the presence of death, Louis would not abandon him. The prince was dead, but the political execution was just beginning. The shock of the murder instantly metastasized into a campaign of blame. For the ultra-royalists, the blood on the saddlemaker's knife was less important than the opportunity to destroy the man standing at the king's right hand. Grief was quickly replaced by political opportunism, and the king found himself fighting a losing battle to save the man he loved from being the next casualty. But the ride back to the Tuileries was a funeral procession for the ministry, not just the prince. The Paris that woke up on February 14th was a city on the edge of hysteria. The shock of the assassination broke the fragile truce Decazes had engineered. The center collapsed. The ultra-royalist press exploded. The newspaper Le Drapeau Blanc published an article that would become infamous. It did not mince words. "The hand that struck the blow belongs to Louvel," it screamed. "But the idea belongs to Monsieur Decazes." This was an open declaration of war. They were accusing the prime minister of moral complicity in the murder of the heir to the throne. Another deputy, Clossel de Coussergues, walked into the Chamber of Deputies and formally proposed a motion to indict Decazes for treason. The accusation was legally baseless. There was zero evidence connecting Decazes to Louvel. But legally baseless charges are often the most politically potent. Decazes tried to fight back. He drafted emergency laws to crack down on the very liberties he had championed. He proposed new censorship, new powers of arrest, hoping to appease the right by showing strength. It was a fatal miscalculation. The left attacked him for betraying his principles, and the right attacked him for being a hypocrite. You cannot save the monarchy with the men who destroyed it, the ultras argued. They didn't want Decazes' laws, they wanted his resignation. The pressure on the king became physical. The royal family laid siege to the Tuileries. The Comte d'Artois, now the father of a murdered son, stormed into the king's study. He did not plead. He demanded. "Sire," Artois said, his voice trembling with a mix of grief and fury, "you must choose between your family and your favorite. The blood of my son is between you and him. If Decazes stays, we go. I will leave the palace. The Duchess of Angoulême will leave. You will be alone." It was the ultimate ultimatum. Louis XVIII looked at his brother. He hated Artois' politics, but he could not rule a kingdom while his entire family went into opposition against him. He was the king, but he was also the head of a house that was rapidly crumbling. "You are unjust," the king replied, his voice weak. "Decazes is innocent. You are sacrificing the only man who knows how to save you." "He is the man who killed my son," Artois retorted. For 3 days, the king held out. It was a testament to the depth of his obsession. The streets were rioting. The parliament was in revolt. The family was packing their bags. And yet Louis XVIII refused to sign the dismissal order. He spent his hours holding Decazes' hand, weeping, railing against the unfairness of the world. "They will drag us both down," Louis said. "I cannot protect you anymore, my son." Decazes, seeing the reality that the king refused to accept, realized it was over. If he stayed, the monarchy would fall. The government was paralyzed. He had to resign to save the king from his own stubbornness. "Sire," Decazes said on February 17th, "for the sake of your throne, I must go." The resignation was accepted, but the king turned it into a drama of separation that embarrassed the court. He did not just dismiss a minister, he mourned a lover. He heaped honors upon Decazes to soften the blow. He made him a duke. He promised him the ambassadorship to London, a prestigious exile that would keep him safe from the knives of the ultras. "I will never love another," the king told him. "You are the last." The departure of Decazes marked the end of the liberal restoration. The ultras swept into power, vindicated by blood. They imposed the white terror they had longed for. Press censorship was restored. Electoral laws were rigged to favor the rich landowners, and the church was given control over education. The reactionaries had won. Louis XVIII remained on the throne, but he was a ghost. Without Decazes, the spark went out of him. He performed his duties mechanically. He signed the papers the new ministers put in front of him. He listened to the reports, but the wit, the intellectual vitality, the engagement, it all vanished. He became the king in the wheelchair, in spirit as well as body, a passive observer of his own reign. The physical separation broke the king's spirit, but it could not sever the obsession. While Decazes navigated the cold reception of the British court, Louis remained in Paris, a ghost in his own palace. The ultras, sensing victory, moved quickly to fill the void with new distractions, unaware that the king's heart was already closed. The correspondence that followed became a lifeline stretched across the English Channel, holding the king to the earth as his body began to fail. However, the story did not end with Decazes' carriage crossing the Channel to England. The physical separation only intensified the emotional connection. The correspondence continued, frantic and voluminous. The king lived for the post. He kept Decazes' letters in a locked portfolio that never left his side. In the silence of his study, he began to construct a shrine to the absent favorite, a psychological space where the system of Decazes still ruled, even as the ultras dismantled it outside the palace walls. Decazes in London was a man adrift. He was the ambassador of France to the court of St. James, a high honor, but he was treated with suspicion by the British aristocracy, who viewed him as a fallen star. He worried constantly about the king's health. He knew the ultras would try to isolate the monarch, to poison his mind, to rewrite history so that Decazes would be remembered only as the villain of 1820. He wrote to the king not just to express affection, but to maintain his influence, to keep the lifeline open. But nature abhors a vacuum, and a king's heart, even a broken one, is a strategic target. The ultras knew that as long as Louis pined for Decazes, they were never truly safe. The king could recall him at any moment. They needed a distraction. They needed to fill the void with someone they could control. They couldn't use a man. The king's preference for male favorites was too dangerous, and he had sworn off them after Decazes. They needed a woman, not a mistress in the carnal sense. The king was past that, but a spiritual friend, a muse who could charm the old man, soothe his grief, and gently guide him away from the liberal path of the exile in London. Enter Madame Zoe Duquesne. She was the perfect instrument for the ultras. Beautiful, pious, intelligent, and deeply royalist, she was coached by the king's enemies on how to approach him. They engineered a meeting. She came to the king petitioning for the return of family lands, playing the damsel in distress. She was instructed to be everything Decazes was not: submissive, religious, a comfort rather than a challenge. Louis XVIII was lonely. He was bored. When Madame Duquesne appeared, he did not fall in love with her. His heart belonged to Decazes, but he allowed himself to be charmed. He needed someone to talk to. He needed someone to sniff the snuff from his waistcoat, a bizarre intimacy he enjoyed. He began to see her regularly. The ultras rejoiced. They believed they had won the battle for the king's soul. They thought that by placing a woman in his life, they would sever the bond with Decazes. They were wrong. They underestimated the complexity of Louis XVIII's psychology. He played along with Madame Duquesne. He granted her favors. But in his letters to London, he mocked her. He reassured Decazes that she was nothing, a mere distraction, a blanket for the cold. "They think they can replace you," Louis wrote. "They are fools. You are my heart. She is my amusement." Yet the distance took its toll. Decazes, watching from London, felt the sting of jealousy. He heard the rumors. He feared he was being forgotten. The tragedy of their relationship shifted from high political drama to the slow, aching erosion of a long-distance affair. Meanwhile, a miracle occurred that changed the political landscape yet again. 7 months after the assassination of the Duc de Berry, his widow, the Duchess Marie Caroline, gave birth. It was a boy, the miracle child, Henri, the Duc de Bordeaux. The Bourbon line was saved. The assassination had failed to kill the dynasty. The birth of the miracle child sent the ultras into a frenzy of religious ecstasy. They claimed God was on their side. The Republic was dead. The monarchy was divine. Louis XVIII looked at the baby, his grandnephew, with a mixture of relief and cynicism. The child secured the succession, yes, but it also strengthened the hand of the Comte d'Artois and the fanatics. The king knew that when he died, the deluge would come. By 1821, Decazes could no longer bear the exile. The political heat had cooled slightly with the birth of the heir. He petitioned to return to France. The king, overjoyed, granted permission, but with a caveat. Decazes could not return to government. He could return to the House of Peers. He could return to the king's private dinners, but he could never again hold the reins of power. The reunion was bittersweet. The Decazes who returned was older, harder, scarred by the accusation of treason. The king who welcomed him was frailer, sinking deeper into the rot of his own body. They picked up their routine, but the electric charge of 1815 was gone. They were survivors of a shipwreck, sitting on the shore, watching the tide come in. The king's health began its final collapse in 1823. Gangrene set in his legs. His body became a living corpse. The stench was so foul that servants fainted. The court avoided his rooms. Even Madame Duquesne, the tool of the ultras, found excuses to stay away. But Decazes came. He sat by the bed where the flesh was turning black. He held the hand that others refused to touch. This was the final test of the favorite. It is easy to love a king when he is dispensing titles and power. It is harder to love him when he is a dying, rotting old man stripped of authority. The Comte d'Artois, waiting impatiently for his brother to die so he could become Charles X, controlled the palace now. He tried to bar Decazes from the death chamber, citing protocol, citing morality, citing anything to keep the hated favorite away. But Louis, in his moments of lucidity, demanded him. "I must say goodbye to my son," the king rasped. The final scene between them was not recorded in the official court circulars. It happened in the quiet hours of the night. Louis XVIII, the last moderate king of France, handed Decazes a final packet of letters. He gave him instructions on how to survive the coming reign of Charles X. Even on his deathbed, his primary concern was the safety of the man he had loved. "The comedy is finished," Louis reportedly said, quoting Rabelais. But looking at Decazes, he added a private postscript, "But the love was real." With the grave closed over Louis XVIII, Élie Decazes was left exposed to the vengeance of the new king, Charles X. Most favorites vanish or perish when their protector dies. But Decazes was not merely a creature of the court. He was a survivor. He knew that the romantic favorite had died with the king, so he birthed a new identity, the pragmatic industrialist. While the Bourbons obsessed over the past, Decazes looked to the future. He invested his fortune in the desolate Aveyron region, betting on the rise of coal and iron. He succeeded brilliantly, founding the town of Decazeville, which still bears his name today. He transformed from the king's son into the king of coal, proving to the snobbish aristocracy that his power came from merit, not just royal affection. He outlived the Bourbon dynasty, watching Charles X crash and burn in the Revolution of 1830, a collapse he and Louis had predicted. Regimes rose and fell, the July monarchy, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, but Decazes remained, an ancient monolith from a forgotten era. Yet in the privacy of his library, away from the smoke of his mines, he remained the guardian of the past. He possessed thousands of letters, the frantic, obsessive notes from Louis XVIII, while custom dictated that such scandalous correspondence be burned to protect the family name. Decazes refused. He curated them, sanitizing some, but preserving the core of the archive. This was his final act of loyalty. By saving the letters, he saved the truth of their bond, a relationship that defied the binary categories of father and son, or lovers. It was a desperate, codependent entanglement that had been the only warm thing in a cold palace. On October 24, 1860, Élie Decazes died at the age of 80, outliving his king by 36 years. He died a duke, a capitalist, and a patriarch. But his will revealed where his heart truly lay. He did not want to be remembered merely for his coal mines or his titles. He wanted to be remembered as the man who had held the hand of a dying, lonely king. The War of the Letters was the only war Louis XVIII ever won, and he won it because Decazes refused to surrender the evidence of their love to the silence of history. In the end, the assassin's knife took the Duc de Berry, and time took the monarchy. But nothing could erase the ink on those pages, the enduring testament to the last great passion of the French throne.